Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading the CTMU. We are reading through the Metaformal System, Completing the Theory of Language by Chris Langan. And we are on the section, The Stratified Theory of Language. So he's been talking a lot about the distinction between natural and formal languages, and sort of gradually introducing the concept of the third metaformal level, which he will be going into in depth later in the paper. And in this section he's going to talk a lot more about that distinction. So diving right in. The standard theory of language recognizes two main classes of language, natural and formal, each occupying its own compartment. These compartments may be respectively described as, number one, the mostly academic study of human language acquisition and usage, and the structure and grammar of various natural languages. A natural language is any human language, whether spoken, written, or manually signed, that appears to have arisen spontaneously and evolved naturally through repetition with variation, usually along with the native culture of a specific population. Natural languages are used for routine self-expression and communication, public speaking, literary production, governance, commerce, and other purposes to which ease and freedom of expression and understanding are important. And number two, the mostly academic and industrial study and application of formal languages and systems and computational languages. Formal languages are often just natural languages that have undergone some degree of formalization, usually with convenient simplification and technical standardization. They are used wherever clarity, precision, and lack of ambiguity are required. Applications include mathematics, the empirical sciences, computer science, engineering, and other fields where exact technical specifications must be expressed and communicated with maximum precision and minimal semantic ambiguity. Just as it would be hard to overstate the importance of natural language to, e.g., human psychology, social organization, and psychosocial evolution, it would be hard to overstate the importance of formal language to science and technology. The mathematical sciences overwhelmingly rely on formal systems, especially proof systems, to achieve their results. The empirical sciences are equally reliant on formal systems, which are theoretically coupled with observation and experimentation as prescribed by the scientific method. As for computer science and the information technology that supports modern civilization, they clearly rely as heavily on language as they do on computers. If we regard natural and formal languages as the first two levels of modern language theory, it is possible to identify a third. Whereas the first two levels are dualistic, taking languages in isolation from their universes, the third is monic and self-dual, structurally fusing language and universe into a single coherent identity on the highest possible level of discourse. Featuring an intrinsic definition of language, which is analogous to intrinsic geometry in its self-containment and external independence, it consists entirely of identities, or coherent self-dual language-universe couplings, and the operators and operations which generate and act on them. I love that sentence. This logico-metaphysical level of language theory is designed to formulate and address fundamental metaphysical and metalogical questions regarding a comprehensive and therefore totally self-contained reality, with respect to which nothing deeper or more extensive exists, regarding which no external references are possible, and in which literally everything comes down to the self-reference of a self-defined language universe complex that has no background and to which nothing intelligible is external. This is the level on which language merges with the universe, and on which signs and symbols merge with their associated objects, interpretations, and interpreters. Or in more pedestrian terms, 3. The level on which language can be productively employed in the conclusive identification and analysis of reality in part and in whole, i.e., on which language and universe are generically coupled in terms of common structure and intelligibility. It is on this level that the true and ultimate nature of reality, that which we know, or that which we can know of it strictly on the basis of our ability to sense it and draw logical inferences about it, can be fruitfully explored. Where the deceptive dualistic isolation of language from universe obscures their true relationship and precludes certainty, conclusive identification is impossible. But as physical reality can in fact be clearly identified through direct observation and logical deduction, without which neither science nor human experience could exist, and as deductive logic is a formal language inherent in cognition, this assumed linguistic incapacity is unfounded and illusory. Hence, the third level of language theory herein proposed already has an irrefutable basis. Let us more closely examine these levels of linguistic theorization. I'll stop there. So here he's just exploring the distinction between natural and formal languages even more. And he talks at the beginning about how formal languages are often where does he say that? Formal languages are often just basically the explication and standardization of natural languages. Where did he say that? Well, no matter. It reminds me of, it was just a confirmation to me about talking about the implicit-explicit distinction between natural and formal languages yesterday. Let's see. The standard theory of language recognizes two main classes of language, natural and formal, each occupying its own compartment. So they're just, this in the standard theory of language, you have this compartmentalization between natural and formal language. You know, they're just so in the habit of compartmentalizing everything, and it is so in line with the paradigm of Cartesian dualism. You know, they start off just as a presupposition that reality is broken down into these separate components. I say they broadly. You know, there are some people with different nuanced beliefs in academia. Probably not everybody's a Cartesian dualist. But it's been so influential in everybody's thinking that I think on some level everybody likes to think of things as being totally compartmentalized in that way, at least on some level of their thinking. So naturally you have this compartmentalization between natural and formal languages. These compartments may be respectively described as the mostly academic study of human language acquisition and usage and the structure and grammar of various natural languages. So you have this distinction between structure and grammar. I think structure also corresponds to syntax, and I know that means something slightly different in natural language theory as it does in formal language theory. If I remember correctly, grammar is talking about the transformation of one expression to another, whereas syntax is talking about like what is a well-formed sentence in and of itself. And I think actually, now that I think about it, that is how it's defined in formal language theory. In natural language theory, I think grammar talks about the structure of a specific sentence, and then structure or syntax talks about I don't know. I want to look that up with y'all. I'm going to open up my handy dandy robot here, to which I have a premium subscription and access to its 4th iteration. What is the distinction between syntax and grammar in natural language theory? In natural language theory, syntax and grammar are closely related concepts. Okay. Syntax refers to the rules and principles that govern the structure of sentences in a language. It focuses on how words and phrases are arranged to form sentences, ensuring that they are constructed in a way that adheres to a specific language's rules, whereas grammar is a broader term that encompasses syntax, along with other linguistic elements such as morphology, the structure of words, phonology, the sound system, semantics, the meaning of word, So grammar and natural language theory is just a superset of syntax. Syntax is a subset. Syntax talks about how words are put together to form a sentence correctly, and grammar talks about that and these other things. Okay. Excellent. I hope y'all don't mind that I employ that a little bit. It's been helpful. I know that sometimes it's inaccurate, and maybe y'all can call out when it is. But you know, I want to emphasize that this is an exploratory series where we're just exploring information together, exploring Chris's work. And so I want to put the disclaimer that everything in here is not necessarily true just because I said it or interpreted that way, or in this case read it from ChatGPT. All right. So that's structure and grammar. A natural language is any human language, whether spoken, written, or manually signed. That's not just sign language, but like people using flags or making fires and sending smoke signals. Could literally be anything using like physical objects in that way to communicate. At least that's how I interpret it. Whether spoken, written, or manually signed, that appears to have arisen spontaneously and evolved naturally through repetition with variation. Yeah, so just over the generations, the new generation learns the language from the old generation and will repeat most of it, although along with the development of the culture that they're immersed in, they will also develop neologisms for new concepts that become relevant, and just natural human creativity will arise with new ideas. And I think it's pretty self-evident how this happens implicitly over time, that a language evolves naturally. And of course they're used for communication, public speaking, literary production, governance, commerce, and other purposes, to which ease and freedom of expression and understanding are important. So you have this mix between convenience, ease, freedom of expression, the freedom of a language user to make up a neologism or say things in a new creative way in order to communicate, like poetry, for example. You have this mix between freedom of constraint there, because obviously you still need to be able to understand what's being said, so you can't just go totally out into left field and write gobbledygook, although perhaps there are some modern poets who would disagree. And then you have the mostly academic and industrial study and application of formal languages and systems and computational languages. Formal languages are often just natural languages that have undergone some degree of formalization, usually with convenient simplification and technical standardization. There you go, that's what I was looking for earlier. And that makes sense to me. I think of it like the fact that, say you're thinking of like the first mathematicians in human history that wanted to clearly, they had these concepts in mind, but they wanted, and they had natural language, and they want to talk about these concepts in a way that won't be subject to this natural language evolution over time, and that was described in the previous paragraph. So they have to strictly define everything and say that this is exactly how we're going to communicate these concepts, and everybody has to adhere to it in order to maintain consistency. So that's how formal languages are often just natural languages that have undergone some degree of formalization. Yes, he uses the word often there. I suppose there are examples where maybe that didn't happen, or maybe he's thinking of a little bit of a different process there. But that's how I interpret it. They are used wherever clarity, precision, and lack of ambiguity are required. Exactly. Applications include mathematics. Yes, all these things which require maximum precision and minimal semantic ambiguity. You have to know what everything means exactly, or else you might as well be using natural language. So just as it would be hard to overstate the importance of natural language to human psychology, social organization, and psychosocial evolution, it would be hard to overstate the importance of formal language to science and technology. The mathematical sciences overwhelmingly rely on formal systems, especially proof systems, to achieve their result. Earlier, I inquired to the robot about what a proof system is as opposed to a formal system, and basically what I got was that a proof system is like a subset or a component of a formal system, where a formal system you have an alphabet, a grammar that includes rules of inference, how the alphabet is put together into well-formed strings or expressions, and then you have a set of valid or well-formed strings that can be constructed using that signature and grammar. Whereas a proof system is specifically just the grammar and the expressions formed with, or I guess specifically just rules of inference, and then proofs, which are sequences of expressions, one after the other, where one follows from the other via a rule of inference, and the overall sequence is called a proof. So a proof system is like looking at an aspect of a formal system where it can make these proofs via their rules of inference. That's my understanding of it. The empirical sciences are equally reliant on formal systems, which are theoretically coupled with observation and experimentation as prescribed by the scientific method. By the way, I just realized that earlier when I defined formal system as an alphabet, grammar, and set of strings, that's actually the definition of a formal language. And a formal system has some nuance to it, but it's very, very similar, and that nuance Chris will go into later in the paper, so I just want to clarify that and save that for later. As for computer science and the information technology that supports modern civilization, yes, clearly they rely heavily on language, as heavily on language as they do on computers, programming languages, etc. It's very explicitly used in all of computer science and IT. If we regard natural and formal languages as the first two levels of modern language theory, it is possible to identify a third. How exciting. Whereas the first two levels are dualistic, they take languages in isolation from their universes. The third is monic and self-dual. You no longer have the luxury of just thinking about a language in isolation from its universe or domain of discourse. Because the goal is to talk about ultimately, ultimate reality, the most comprehensive level of reality that he goes into later. And so you can't leave anything out when doing that, otherwise you're not ultimate enough. And so it has to be monic and self-dual, where the two dual sides are language and universe, and they are structurally fused into a single coherent identity on the highest possible level of discourse. Featuring an intrinsic definition of language, which is analogous to intrinsic geometry in its self-containment and external independence. It consists entirely of identities, or coherent self-dual language-universe couplings, and the operators and operations which generate and act on them. So, you might not be familiar with what intrinsic geometry is. I'm only sort of generally, vaguely familiar with it. So maybe we can jump over here to our helpful robot assistant and ask, give a clear example of intrinsic geometry. And explain how it satisfies the definition of intrinsic geometry after giving the definition. I'm laughing because I hope y'all don't mind me using this. I really find it useful. And it's just funny because such a short time ago it would not have been possible to do this. Intrinsic geometry is concerned with the properties of a surface or space that are dependent solely on the shape itself, without reference to the surrounding space. A classic example of intrinsic geometry is the surface of a sphere such as Earth. Yes. Makes sense? So yes, just talking about the geometry of the surface of a sphere without considering the space that embeds the sphere, you know. That's what intrinsic geometry is. Let's see. Yes, one of the most famous examples of intrinsic geometry on a sphere is the case of geodesics, or great circles. For example, airplanes follow paths that look curved on a flat map, but are actually taking the shortest route between 2 points on the globe. This is because of that the Earth's surface is curved, and the shortest distance, known as a geodesic, follows a great circle. Very cool. How does that satisfy the definition of intrinsic geometry? Well, intrinsic geometry focuses on the properties and measurements within a geometric space. There, that ought to be a little better for y'all. That are independent of its embedding or representation in a higher dimensional space. These properties are determined by the distances and angles within the space itself, rather than by how the space looks from the outside. The classic definition involves examining the geometry from the inside without reference to an external space. So you're putting yourself inside of what could otherwise be viewed as a subset of a space, like the surface of a sphere, you know, not the volume of the sphere, just the surface. Imagine that you're a two-dimensional entity living on the surface. This two-dimensional world that you live in has certain properties that are determined by the curvature of the sphere. But while you are a two-dimensional entity living on the surface, it obviously doesn't look like a sphere, you know, it just looks like a flat plane that has these strange non-Euclidean properties. That I remember that this is what non-Euclidean, or at least an application of non-Euclidean geometry, where, you know, Euclid came out with his book, The Elements, and had his axioms, and they were talking about a situation where you have these, for example, one of the axioms is that two parallel lines, make sure I'm getting this right. I don't know if this applies to the situation of a sphere, but I think that Euclid, one of the axioms is that two parallel lines, you know, never touch, and that there's some case in non-Euclidean geometry where they actually do touch because of the curvature involved. Does non-Euclidean geometry break the axiom? I'm a very poor speller, by the way. I'm just going to choose not to be embarrassed. Alright. Does non-Euclidean geometry break the axiom of parallel lines not touching? Yes, it indeed diverges from the parallel postulate, which states that for any given line and a point not on that line, there is exactly one line parallel to the given line. Okay, that's what it is. That's actually what that axiom is. For any line and a point not on that line, there's exactly one line parallel to the given line that passes through that point. And this parallel line will never intersect the given line. Non-Euclidean geometry explores the consequences of altering this axiom, leading to geometries where the parallel postulate, so for example, hyperbolic geometry. In hyperbolic geometry, the parallel postulate is replaced by the statement. Okay, here we go. Spherical. Let's just go to something more familiar. In spherical geometry, the parallel postulate is contradicted by the fact that all lines eventually intersect. This is easy to visualize on the surface of a sphere where lines are represented by great circles. These are those geodesics. Or I guess the geodesics are parts of those great circles. Any two great circles on a sphere, such as the lines of longitude, will intersect at 2 points unless they are the same great circle. Well, there you have it. I'm just going to leave that at that. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much. Because really the point is that that is an example of a situation where you are immersing yourself onto or you are formulating a geometry that's totally self-contained to a particular context, in that case, the surface of a sphere. And all of the distances and angles and other geometric and topological properties are totally contained within that domain. That is intrinsic geometry. And Chris is saying here that for a reality that is totally closed, comprehensive, reality must be closed, as Chris wrote as the reality principle, and in other parts as the analytic reality closure principle. Reality contains all and only that which is real. If there's something real that's outside of reality, then obviously you haven't defined reality broad enough, because it doesn't include all the things that are real. And what's the point of defining reality if it doesn't contain all of its instances? It doesn't make sense as a definition. So any proper and meaningful definition of reality has to include everything that's real, and therefore, if you suppose that something were outside of it, it would be unreal and therefore wouldn't actually exist. Or at least would be totally irrelevant. Totally, what is the word Chris uses? I guess it's basically relevance. It would be totally irrelevant to the context of reality, and therefore would not have any role in anything to do with the reality, such as defining it or any of its identities or operations therein. So featuring an intrinsic definition of language, which is analogous to intrinsic geometry in its self-containment and external independence. So there you go, external independence. That's exactly what I was just talking about. It's independent of anything ostensibly external to it. It consists entirely of identities. So the whole system is itself a monic self-dual language universe coupling or identity, and it consists entirely of monic self-dual language universe couplings or identities. So it's totally structurally self-similar in that way. It just is. It is an identity, and it consists entirely of identities. And Chris goes in other papers into all sorts of logical consequences of that fact. And let's see, entirely of identities or coherent self-dual language universe couplings. Yes, You have these language universe couplings, or intension extension couplings, or attribute value couplings. These are all different ways of saying the same thing. And they're self-dual in the sense that they're dual aspects of the same underlying identity, and they are dually isomorphic to each other in the sense that they totally faithfully reflect each other's structure, just in a dual way. And they're coherent, which means that they act as a whole. They can be regarded as a whole, and you can't really break them down into smaller pieces without losing the fundamental nature of that thing. It's irreducible. I think of coherence like, functioning as a whole, being irreducible, that type of thing. And the operators and operations which generate and act on them. An operator is something that transforms, that takes something and transforms it into something else, like in linear algebra. I was recently looking at linear algebra. I hope this isn't too complex of an example, but you have these linear operators, which are matrices that take basically that take the base vectors of a vector space and transform them into different base vectors with different values. And just as they do that to the base vectors of the space, they do that to every other vector in the space in a linear way, which we don't have to define here. That's just an example. I really hope that's not, well, I wouldn't have been very familiar with that example just a few weeks ago, so it might be it's something that I've studied recently. I hope it's helpful to somebody. Maybe it'll inspire some people to look into that. It's a really cool thing, and it's very relevant to like quantum mechanics, for example, which is of course very relevant to reality theory and the CTMU. And Chris has a whole paper called Quantum Metamechanics, where he talks about how to map different interpretations of quantum mechanics into the CTMU and interpret quantum mechanics itself in the CTMU. It's a very cool paper. That's what led me to study linear algebra. Very cool topic. But moving on. This logico-metaphysical level of language theory is designed to formulate and address fundamental metaphysical and metalogical questions regarding a comprehensive and therefore totally self-contained reality, with respect to which nothing deeper or more extensive exists. So it's totally comprehensive reality. Yes, this logico-metaphysical level of language theory. That's a cool word, logico-metaphysical. He's coupling logic and metaphysics on this level. And it's designed to both formulate and address fundamental metaphysical and logical questions. So it not only addresses the existing questions, but can also formulate new questions and then answer them. How awesome is that? Regarding a comprehensive and therefore totally self-contained reality. It's like that intrinsic language idea. Intrinsic reality is intrinsic, totally comprehensive and self-contained. With respect to which nothing deeper or more extensive exists. Yeah. A deeper reality would include more and would therefore be more extensive, because it would have a greater extension or set of instances, regarding which no external references are possible. You can't refer to something outside reality because everywhere you point is inside reality. Everything you think is inside reality. Even the concept of non-reality or being outside of reality or anything like that is immersed within your cognitive language and therefore a part of reality. And in which literally everything comes down to the self-reference of a self-defined language universe complex that has no background and to which nothing intelligible is external. So everything comes down to the self-reference of a self-defined language universe complex. That I think that's kind of like what I was saying before with the fact that the overall system, reality itself, is an identity, and everything in it has that same structure as an identity, and so can be considered as referring to the overall self of reality, or that basic identity. In order for us to be an identity, we are immersed and reference the fact that there is reality itself, which already has this structure of an identity. And so we are self-referential instances of that identity. Comes down to the self-reference of a self-defined language universe complex. So this identity, this overall identity of reality, containing all of these levels of lesser identities within it, forms a massive language universe complex that has no background and to which nothing intelligible is external. That's like what I was saying before, where you can't even conceive of non-reality or being outside of reality, because any concept that you form is inside your mind and therefore a part of reality. And the content of that concept as well is also in your mind and immersed in cognitive syntax and in overall reality and reality syntax. This is the level on which language merges with universe. Very cool. And on which signs and symbols merge with their associated objects, interpretations, and interpreters. So the fact that reality is monic and self-dual, there's only one reality to which we can intelligibly refer. And so it's monic. But you have these two aspects that are everywhere present within language and universe, but they're merged in that monism. So that's that dual aspect monism of the CTMU. And signs and symbols merge with their associated objects, interpretations, and interpreters, as Chris will go into later in the paper. The objects in the physical universe itself are the signs or elements of the signature or alphabet of the metaformal system. Or in more pedestrian terms, the level on which language can be productively employed in the conclusive identification and analysis of reality in part and in whole, i.e. on which language and universe are generically coupled in terms of common structure and intelligibility. It is on this level Just lost my place, sorry. It is on this level that the true and ultimate nature of reality that which we can know of it strictly on the basis of our ability to sense it and draw logical inferences about it can be fruitfully explored. So this ability that we have to sense reality through both our direct perceptual and direct cognitive awareness. We have these perceptions, but we also have this direct experience that of just being a cognitive, self-aware entity. And then we are able to draw logical conclusions just from the fact that we have these things without even having to assume them. We exist. Chris refers sometimes to the cogito ergo sum of Descartes, and which means I think therefore I am, and ses percepi of Berkeley, which I forget the exact translation of it. I'm gonna look that up real quick. Esse est percepi. To be is to be perceived. Yeah, so you have I think therefore I am from Descartes, and to be is to be perceived from Berkeley, referring to both of these components that were given, that just in order to exist you have these components. We have not yet found an example of something that exists and isn't perceivable. And duly, we have not yet no one has sat down thinking that they exist. Or how would you phrase that? You can't exist. You can't say that you exist without having the necessary cognitive ability to formulate that expression. And maybe you could split hairs about, a robot or something, or ChatGPT saying it exists, or whatever, and split hairs about that, but ultimately I think that it has to do with a generalization of cognition that is present, and perhaps a distribution of generic self-awareness throughout the universe. Subatomic particles even interact with each other and have to, on some level, have some sort of, I am generic level of awareness to be able to recognize their own state and the state of other particles and be transformed. Although that's a really kind of deep question about when you get to the level of subatomic particles, which correspond to tertiary syntactors in the CTMU, but that's a rabbit hole we don't have to go into right now. The point is that you're not going to find anybody that doesn't have this this ability to cognate and perceive. And the fact that you can derive logical conclusions about it that are inescapable is what gives the ability to come to the conclusion of the CTMU, which is, which Chris says is basically is exactly that which is logically inescapable given our direct perception and cognition of reality. So I'd say, until somebody can argue their way out of their direct perception and cognition, or find some logical gap or mistake in the reasoning from those from that basis to the conclusion of the CTMU, they're not going to be able to get out of any of this. And that's what Chris says all the time. And just as a personal testimony, I've been reading it and studying it for a long time. And haven't found a mistake yet, so. I mean, it just really, once you become familiar with it enough, it just starts to make intuitive sense. And you come to a realization that it's not. It doesn't even make sense to think. Just any alternative to it doesn't ultimately make sense. So, but whether you're at that point with the CTMU or not, you should still study the CTMU. Like, say you're not at that point with the CTMU and you think it is refutable. Well, if you want to make a valid refutation of it, you're going to have to study it a lot, because otherwise your refutation is going to be either a straw man, not really referring to the CTMU, or is going to be, it's just not going to have it's just not going to be a valid refutation. But I maintain there is no valid refutation to the CTMU. I do believe the CTMU is absolute truth. I do believe that it is what humanity needs to understand in order to understand the nature of reality and know that God exists, that our lives are a spiritual journey, or that we are essentially an image of God having a human experience, and we should act accordingly. But personal testimony aside, that's this section of the Metaformal System. Thank y'all so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing y'all in the next video. Have a very blessed day.